Good afternoon, and thank you for coming. My name is Don Hube, and I'm the director of the Ohio State Center for Ethics and Human Values. One of the primary aims of the Center for Ethics and Human Values is to help the university fulfill the mission that's embodied in its motto, Education for Citizenship. We do this through different events and programs, including the COMPAS program, which stands for Conversations on Morality, Politics, and Society, and we describe it as a year-long university-wide conversation on a topic that raises foundational moral questions and needs the input from lots of different disciplines to be addressed. This year's COMPAS, by the way, is on inequality, which meshes nicely with today's lecture. This afternoon's event, the first in an annual series of distinguished lectures in ethics, is another contribution to our effort to fulfill the university's mission. We're delighted to inaugurate the series with today's speaker. I probably didn't emphasize that correctly. We're really delighted to present today's speaker. But my job is not to introduce our speaker. I'm one step removed from that. I am introducing the person who will introduce the speaker. First, though, a few words of gratitude are appropriate. Many units at the university partnered to make this event possible. We are indebted to the Honors and Scholars Program, the Office of International Affairs, the Office of Research, the Department of Agricultural, Environmental, and Development Economics, the Department of Economics, the Department of Philosophy, the Department of Political Science, the Mershon Center for International Security Studies, the Humanities Institute, the Sustainable and Resilient Economies Program, the Ohio State University Lima campus, and the Department of Philosophy at the College of Wooster. That gives you some indication of the breadth of interest in today's speaker. I also want to express my gratitude to some people that made this event possible: the Associate Director of the Center for Ethics and Human Values, Steve Brown, and our two terrific graduate associates, Krista Johnson and Lavender McKittrick-Schweitzer. At the conclusion of today's lecture, there will be an opportunity for questions and answers. There are two microphones at the front of each of these two center aisles. If you have a question for our speaker, please line up behind the microphones, and we'll alternate with questions between the two microphones until we run out of time. It's my pleasure now to introduce the person who will introduce our speaker today, Executive Vice President and Provost Bruce McFerrin. Provost McFerrin is a professor of entomology and a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He joined the faculty at OSU in 2012 as Vice President for Agricultural Administration and the Dean of the College of Food, Agriculture, and Environmental Sciences. But he was a Buckeye long before 2012. He earned his BA in entomology from Ohio State in 1976. Provost McFerrin has been a strong supporter of the Center for Ethics and Human Values, and more generally the mission to which it contributes, the broad and interdisciplinary search for transformative solutions to the grand challenges of the 21st century. Please join me in welcoming Provost McFerrin.
Good afternoon, everyone, and let me extend my welcome as well. The Center for Ethics and Human Values was formally established just a year ago, although its leaders have been organizing and sponsoring events for several years across campus before that. Among the Center's strategies is a plan to bring an eminent speaker to our campus annually to focus attention on a matter of moral concern. Today, the Center presents its first annual Center for Ethics and Human Values Distinguished Lecture in Ethics. The title, What's Wrong with Inequality, also fits with the Center's Conversations on Morality, Politics, and Society programs, this year focusing on the theme of inequality. As a university community, we believe in and support the core value of bringing together faculty, students, and staff from a variety of disciplines to discuss the interactions and impact of significant human issues and the underlying importance of their ethical and moral implications. We're grateful to Don Hubin and his colleagues in the center and beyond, including the departments, units, and campuses that co-sponsored today's lecture, for helping the university community focus our attention on critical issues that raise ethical concerns. Today we have the distinct honor of welcoming Amartya Sen, the Thomas W. Lamont University professor and professor of economics and philosophy at Harvard University. Professor Sen's lifelong work has contributed to welfare economics, social choice theory, economic theory of families, and other indices that measure the well-being of people in developing countries. Among his many recognitions and honors, Professor Sen was awarded the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences in 1998. Please join me in welcoming our renowned guest, Professor Amartya Sen.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, it's a great privilege for me to be here and to have the opportunity of speaking with you. And also, since the new Center for Ethics and Human Values in this university is already establishing itself as a major area of new thinking, it's also wonderful to have the chance for me to get affiliated with the center through this particular occasion today. The way the beginning of meetings tend to be different in different universities. In some places you all come together, and here you seem to come one after another. So I haven't heard whether they said anything about me and whether it was a good thing or bad thing. If they were good things, I thank them very much. And if they're bad things, I will try to improve. But it's the sense of the grandness of being invited by the provost and having the opportunity of interacting with the university in addition to the center is certainly a very pleasing one for me. So as you probably know, the title is What's Wrong with Inequality? Equality in one form or another has a huge appeal in nearly every society known to us. It is, in fact, a value that communicates something warm and friendly even before its implications are fully worked out. The jolly poetry in demand of equality in Gilbert and Sullivan's Gondoliers radiates its invocation easily to all. So I quote from that: all shall equal be, the earl, the marquis, and the duke, the groom, the butler, and the cook, the aristocrat who banks with Kurz, which is a very kind of upper-class bank, or used to be, the aristocrat who cleans the boots. However, while it's important to applaud that lovely song, we must also dig a bit deeper and subject to the appealing sentiment to critical scrutiny. For this Center for Ethics and Human Values, my host in today's lecture, I believe these are particularly relevant engagements to pursue. So that's why I'm motivated to ask the question, what's wrong with inequality? It's also important to ask what lies behind the instinctive appeal of equality, to the extent there is that appeal, and also subject that positive instinct about the greatness of equality to careful scrutiny and ask why and how and when and in what way. Perhaps the foundational reason for shunning inequality lies in the general value of avoiding arbitrariness. In assessing social arrangements, it's hard to accept the case for giving more consideration to the interests of some people than to those of others, without there being some clearly discernible reason for paying particular attention to the favored people. This is a demand for equality at a very foundational level. It's like saying that if you're speaking to people in a gathering, you're speaking to all, rather than just number 17, 18, and 19. It's not necessarily, however, a demand for equality of income or wealth in particular. The basic demand for fairness in having similar concern for all and paying symmetric attention to everyone can be seen as being reflected in the fact that all the ethical theories of social arrangements that have made powerful appeal and have had a considerable plausibility or seen as having that, all of them demand equality of something that is regarded as particularly important in that theory. The theories involved are diverse and frequently at war with each other, but they all share the common feature on insisting on equality in terms of the central variables of that respective theory. Let me illustrate. Consider examples of some of the principal theories of political philosophy, with which some of you may be familiar and others could easily appreciate what they are about. In the theory of justice presented by the leading political philosopher of our time, namely John Rawls, the idea of equality figures prominently in the form of demand first for equal liberty for all, and also for equality, subject to some efficiency consideration, in the distribution of means, general purpose resources, what Rawls calls primary goods. Similarly, Ronald Dworkin, one of the leading liberal theorists of justice, demands the need for, I quote, treating all people as equal, and he goes on to argue in favor of equality of resources, actually extending Rawls's ideas. Some of you may not, however, be persuaded by these examples, since Rawls and Dworkin are seen as being politically inclined in the egalitarian direction in their general ideas and thoughts. But let us then consider theorists who cannot be taken at all to be predisposed towards egalitarianism. Equality, in some centrally important terms, is in fact demanded by those who are typically seen as being very tolerant of unequal incomes and wealth. For example, Robert Novick, a Harvard philosopher, one of the finest libertarian theorists, may not demand equality of utility or equality of resources, but he does demand equality of libertarian rights. No one should have any more right to liberty than anyone else. And remember, liberty is the central concern in his theory. Similarly, James Buchanan, typically seen as a conservative public choice theorist, builds equal legal and political treatment into his vision of a just society. In each theory, equality is sought in some space, as we sometimes use in terms of some variable, a space that is seen as having a central role in that particular theory. The need to invoke some kind of equality in terms of the variables that are central to the respective theories, whether incomes, resources, primary goods, liberties, or rights, is ultimately dependent on giving everyone equal consideration in terms of the basic demands of the respective theory. It is thus appropriate to think of the question, what's wrong with inequality, as being ultimately analyzable in terms of the need for giving equal consideration to all, even when the perspective in which considerations have to be given varies widely between one theory and another. Some case liberty, in some case income, some case wealth, sometimes resources, or whatever. There are many others. What can we conclude from this? One conclusion certainly must be that being egalitarian, that is, being keen on equality in some space or other, is not really a uniting feature. Indeed, it is precisely because there are such substantive differences between the endorsement of different spaces in which equality is recommended by different authors that the basic similarity between them, in the form of wanting equality in some space that is seen by them as important, can be far from transparent. The pervasiveness of the demand for equality in an appropriate form for each theory of justice has, as a result, also tended to remain quite hidden. Another conclusion to draw is that the avoidance of arbitrariness need not automatically translate into an ethical case against economic or social inequality in particular, which is the context in which it's most often discussed. And yet, this line of approach can help to build the foundation for such a case at least for avoiding gross inequality of income or of wealth. It's in fact an invitation to reasoning, with a strong enticement to seek an appropriate way of giving concreteness to avoiding arbitrary inequality of attention, and moving from there to valuing economic and social equity. For example, in demanding gender equity between women and men, the argument can very easily start with noting that there is no particular reason at all why men should be given certain privileges, the corresponding parts of which are denied to women. Avoidance of arbitrariness is central to ethics. And the place of equality, in particular the shunning of severe inequality, is linked to reasoning with precisely that avoidance. Arguments against inequality between classes or races or genders, or for that matter between different individuals who differ from each other in many distinct ways, have to be linked through reasoning to the variables to which particular theories of justice attach importance. And here's the question arises, namely, is inequality in each of these spaces equally serious, or are they serious at all? And how do we think about the choice of space? Because ultimately, the issue of inequality, as I've been arguing, turns on the space or the variables to which the particular theory attaches importance. It is obvious that not all inequalities may be seen as reprehensible in any theory. And the ethical acceptability of inequality must depend on the variables in terms of which inequality between people is being examined. Let me begin with a very easy case. I read in the paper, I think only last week, that the Associated Press recently found a copy of the birth certificate of the singer Doris Day in the States, that is Ohio's Office of Vital Statistics, which definitively established that the singer, Doris Day, who was so very popular throughout the world when I was a young man, is not in fact 93, as she and others had supposed, but actually 95 years old. I do not have to belabor the point for anyone who knows how to calculate these things, that this involves a slight increase in inequality, age-based inequality in Ohio and in the world. But that recognition need not be seen as unwelcome. Indeed, we can warmly wish the great singer many more years to come, making more and more contribution to increasing inequality of the age distribution, and hope that this defies the unpredictability of the future about which Doris Day had sung in a song in my early days, 50 years ago, at least 40 years ago, was extraordinarily popular, called Que Sera, Sera, whatever will be, the future is not ours to see. As the famous songstress advances in her age, continuously increasing the inequality in age distribution, we may find a cause for celebration, not grief. However, the news of increase in the inequality of income or wealth, as has been happening over many parts of the world over recent years, including the United States, need not receive such warm welcome. The division between the rich and the poor is being seen traditionally for a long time as an unwelcome sight in itself. Jesus Christ himself was perhaps more powerfully vocal on the subject than anyone else. But it can be shown how such chasms make the lives of the poor unbearable in a way that would not have happened in the absence of extreme inequality. There is, in fact, much empirical evidence that living in unequal societies, with some people being much worse off economically and socially than others, tends to produce deprivation in the absolute quality of life that people in the bottom layers respectively enjoy. For example, Michael Marmot, a famous British doctor and medical professional, in his famous studies called the Whitehall Gradient, established that in a community of British civil servants who work in Whitehall, this is called the Whitehall Gradient, the underdogs are not only less privileged than others, but also have a significantly lower life expectancy. There's an interesting thing to discuss here. That is, there are lives, in many ways, the lives of these people may go worse because they are poorer. These are all civil servants in Britain. And the lower down the scale, you have lower income. But more important for Michael Marmot, lower power, lower control over your life. You're ordered around by others, told what to do, and you don't take your own decisions. Now, this tends to not only lead to a deprivation in itself, because that's not a good way of living, but it seems to produce habits of the kind that we associate with fighting against frustration: excessive drinking, smoking, a dysfunctional lifestyle that doesn't go the way the top dogs would lead their leisure time. They might go home, do a bit of workout, have an exercise, and after the exercise, do some reading and go to bed quietly and happy. And what Michael Marmot's medical analysis shows that this has a profound impact in life expectancy. In fact, in some cases, almost half the life expectancy of the people at the bottom layer. There have been other studies related to this kind of work, for example, by Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson. I think the book is called The Spirit Level. They have given extensive evidence of the deprivation of health, longevity, and general well-being caused by living under unequal conditions. This can be seen as absolute deprivation generated by relative inequality. Oddly enough, and I won't have time to go into it now, though if it comes up in Q&A time, I'm happy to respond it. The first person to discuss this phenomenon was Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, when he pointed out how relative inequality can generate absolute deprivation of lifestyle. This line of reasoning had been well captured by the idea of what is called social determinants of health. And on that subject, the World Health Organization, the WHO, has published an important report produced by a committee chaired by Michael Marmot himself. Advancing the health of the people of the world seem to need not only better health care, which is so very important and have been so much in the debate here in the context of affordable health care and the attempt to gut it, and important as it undoubtedly is, I mean, there's no question affordable health care and this whole issue of coverage is very important, but it's not sufficient. There is an issue of inequality of incomes, resources, and also of power that's relevant to it. Big inequalities of income and wealth, it can be argued, are terrible not merely because they may be aesthetically unattractive and directly challenging for the people in the bottom layer, but also because, indeed mainly because, they contribute to disparities and deprivation and serious deprivations in people's living conditions and their freedom to do what they have reason to value. If our concentration on the actual lives of people, the question that immediately, if our concentration is on the actual lives of people, the question that immediately arises is how to understand and assess the richness and poverty of human life. Here I have to declare an interest, and the approach I've tried to pursue in a recent book called The Idea of Justice, published in 2009, has largely focused on freedom that people actually enjoy to do this or do that, to be this or be that, depending on what they would like to do or be. So this is an idea of freedom in the classic sense, namely you're free to be what you want to be. This contrasts not merely with focusing on income and wealth as such, rather than their role in generating inequality of living conditions and people's freedoms, but also with many other approaches, the contrast. For example, a contrast will be in the formal theories of libertarian rights, where you look at the formal rights that people have, whether or not these rights can be actually exercised. The question there is anyone stopping you? If not, you have that freedom, whether or not you actually have the freedom to do it. It is, of course, good to know, and I'm not dismissing it, that we are not prevented from doing certain things, which the state might prevent us, and that is important, or others may prevent us, and that's also important. But there are lots of things where the freedom is not primarily limited by what others do, but by your means. For example, no one may stop a destitute from going to Acapulco for a holiday, but the difficulty in going to Acapulco for a holiday may arise not from that reason, but from other reasons. An approach based on freedom insists that we scrutinize and assess the different features of living and their combinations that a person can choose from. This takes us naturally enough beyond the domain of formal rights, often better these formal rights, which are often better described as permissions rather than facilitation, that the institutional perspective of libertarian philosophy has tended to highlight. If the requirement to go beyond institutional libertarianism is one necessity, the need to go beyond the mental metrics of utilities in the form of pleasure or desire fulfillment is surely another important issue. The evaluative exercise of taking note of people's actual freedoms cannot be avoided by concentrating instead only on some features of mental reactions to it, such as pleasures, happiness, or desire fulfillment. As utilitarians, from Jeremy Bentham onward, have tended to suggest. John Stuart Mill was the exception to that as a utilitarian who was deeply skeptical of this. And that was perhaps because he was never really a full utilitarian. I learned from Richard Reeves' wonderful biography of Mill that when he was 15, he was very tempted by Benthamite utilitarianism. And I think 15 is a very good age for being a Benthamite utilitarian. Even if a chronically deprived person, a precarious landless laborer, or a subjugated housewife, or a chronically unemployed person learns to accept cheerfully her deprived lifestyle, and indeed underprivileged people without hope of liberation often try to do just that, to cope with the inescapability of the deprivation involved, that cultivated cheerfulness will not eliminate the real deprivation from which she will continue to suffer. The approach of concentrating on actual freedom does, however, meet resistance not only from utilitarian or institutional libertarians, but also from many others, even though the opposition is often indirect and implicit rather than direct and explicit. As it happened, freedom is not only among the most valued ideas in the world, it's also among the most feared of human conditions. With freedom comes both opportunity and responsibility, and while the former may be prized, the latter can cause anxiety and concern. This conflict has engaged many distinguished psychologists. But if the problem arises even in your first-person thought, it arises very much more in the third-person thought. That is, in a purely individual context, it's typically not the case that people fear freedom in their own lives. As the great French political theorist Tocqueville, a historian, noted more than a century and a half ago in his book on the ancient regime, published in 1856, I quote from Tocqueville, "Despots themselves do not deny that freedom is excellent. Only the desire is for themselves alone, and they maintain that everyone else is altogether unworthy of it," unquote. Those who are afraid of freedom tend mostly to be afraid of freedom of others. Disaffected underdogs of society, the discontented lower classes, the aggrieved masses in a country with a high growth but social bipolarization, as for example in my country in India, disgruntled feminists grumbling about their assigned place of women, the rebellious youth refusing to be compliant and obedient, and in many authoritarian societies, determined dissidents protesting about the existing order. It is other people's freedom that have worried commentators who are suspicious of the perspective of freedom and who have not, however, offered to give up their own. Those who find the perspective of freedom to be deeply suspect can entertain disparate beliefs with very different diagnoses of where the poison lies. The poison could be democratic rights, civil liberties, freedom of market transaction, or basic social opportunities such as the emancipation involved in women being educated. As you can see, these examples indicate the attacks can come from many different directions. Their respective suspicions of freedom leads to the advocacy and imposition of unfreedoms of one kind or another in political, economic, or social fields. This applies as much to authoritarian rulers, including military dictators, as to intellectual commentators, including many leaders of thought who have championed what they describe as order, discipline, and necessary sacrifice for higher causes. For example, for successful economic development, what can be best described as the blood, sweat, and tears view of development. Even though empirical evidence is plentiful in the literature on development that there is no basic enmity between freedom and development, the blood, sweat, and tears view continues to resurface in many practical debates going on today. In India, it surfaced very recently when the government decided to get rid of 86% of the cash in a demonetization move. This, of course, was disastrous for the economy, and the nature of the disaster is slowly unfolding. On the other hand, that was a huge vote getter, and the ruling government's argument was that if you want the goodness of the country, then you have to make sacrifice. And those who are critical of this decision don't want to make the sacrifice. Sacrifice is a huge appeal, I must say. It's amazing how appealing it is. If it hurts, it must be doing some good. It's a thought that's so common that the blood, sweat, and tears view is very difficult to eradicate from one's thinking, even though there's hardly any example of successful development through the blood, sweat, and tears angle. In pursuing the perspective of freedom, there are, of course, many difficulties to be faced. That has to be admitted, and problems to be resolved. Because freedom has many aspects, it is necessary both to distinguish between them and to choose the focus of analysis depending on the nature of the problem that is being addressed. Freedom has to be seen as a very broad perspective, with varying relevance of its different aspects in different exercises. For example, in dealing with the issue of torture and the unacceptability of torturing a prisoner or a suspect as a means for other ends, which is important in the classical libertarian aspect of freedom. And what it is really arguing for is the need for immunity of everyone from deliberate infliction of pain and other harms by others, more powerful people in the society. At one stage it seemed that that particular debate has gone away from the United States, but it seems to have returned now. The focus has to be somewhat different when the concentration is mainly on issues of economic and social advantage, and in general about the inequality of the deals that different people get in any society. These aspects of freedom can be captured better by what is called in the new literature capability, which reflects opportunities a person actually enjoys to do this or be that, things that he or she may value doing or being and have reason to value being and doing. Obviously, things we value most are particularly important for us to be able to achieve. But the idea of freedom also respects our being free to determine what we want, what we value, and ultimately what we decide to choose and for what reason. The idea of actual capability, not just potential, but the actual power as a reflection of freedom, is central to the capability perspective. It's easily checked that means such as income and other resources, while valuable in the pursuit of capabilities, are not themselves indicators of the capabilities that people actually have. The ability of a person to convert resources into capabilities depends on a variety of contingent circumstances. For example, the person's biological, physical, and mental characteristics, his or her proneness to illness, the physical, social, and epidemiological environment in which the person lives, and so on. The real opportunities that different persons enjoy are very substantially influenced by variation of individual circumstances, age, disability, proneness to illness, specific talents or the absence thereof, gender, and the state of being in maternity, for example. And also by disparities in the natural and social environment, epidemiological conditions, extent of pollution, the prevalence of local crime. Under these circumstances, an exclusive concentration on inequalities in income distribution cannot in any way be adequate for an understanding of even economic inequality. Valuing human freedom differs thus from focusing on income and wealth, which, as Aristotle had noted, is, I quote, that is, income or wealth, is evident, I'm quoting from Aristotle, wealth is not the good we are seeking, for it is merely useful and for the sake of something else, unquote. If we focus on freedoms, we would, of course, be interested in income and wealth as on instrumental grounds that persons respectively have, and other such means captured within what John Rawls calls primary goods. But ultimately, we have to examine the freedoms that people actually enjoy. For example, being disabled has a double effect in reducing the person's ability to earn an income, what can be called the earning handicap, and making the conversion of income into good living that much harder thanks to the cost of prosthesis and the impossibility of fully correcting certain types of disadvantages caused by disability. And this can be called conversion handicap. For example, a person who happens to be, say, crippled by an accident or by illness may need assistance or a prosthesis or both, and even with them, the person may not become as able to move around freely as someone without that disability. The conversion handicap refers to the disadvantage that a disabled person has in converting money into good living. A system of poverty removal that concentrates only on the lowness of income, in particular whether a person or family's income is below what is defined in that country as the poverty line, will catch the earning handicap, but not the conversion handicap. And this could make the poverty relief program fundamentally inadequate and ineffective. Let me illustrate the influence of conversion handicap with some results from poverty studies in the United Kingdom obtained by Wibke Kuckles, a young German woman, in an illuminating thesis recently completed in Cambridge University. Unfortunately, she herself had a huge problem and diagnosed as having cancer shortly after her PhD and died. But the work that she did was extraordinarily important. Let me try to summarize it very quickly. She took a poverty line as being 60% of the British national median income. So you look at British income, take the median income, and take 60% off it, and anyone below it is called poor. Kuckles finds that about 80% of individuals lived in family, 1/8, in families with below poverty line income. If attention is now shifted to individuals in families with a disabled member, the percentage of such individuals living in the below poverty line income is just about 23. So it rises from 18 to 18 when you look at all families, 23 when you look at families with disability. This gap of about 5% point would largely reflect the earning handicap associated with disability of the affected matters and the earning disadvantages of those who have to care for the disabled among other members of the family. If now conversion handicap is introduced and note is taken of the need for more income to ameliorate the disadvantages of disability to the extent it can be ameliorated through prosthesis and other counteracting arrangements, the proportion of individuals in families with disabled members, now you have to adjust the income needed to avoid poverty by including in it the cost of prosthesis. And if you fall below that, you will be poor. The proportion of the poverty ratio then jumps from 23% to 47%. Indeed, the bulk of poverty, even in terms of inadequate income just for prosthesis, turns out to be due to conversion handicap. the gap between 23 and 47, going well beyond the earning handicap, that's 5% between 18 and 23, on which the standard poverty statistics almost in every country concentrates. I think the quick list method is not used in any country, including in this one. This can make the poverty relief program inadequate and one-sided unless we look not just at low income earned, but also at the insufficiency of income to overcome the capability disadvantage related to conversion handicap. And bear in mind that even with the processes, the disabled person will probably continue to suffer from handicap, which an able-bodied person would not. So this is an underestimate rather than overestimate. In general, going beyond the particular domain of policies for poverty removal, we have to take interest in the overall capabilities that any person enjoys to lead the kind of life she has reason to want to lead. And this requires that attention be paid to her personal as well as environmental characteristics, going beyond the income statistics. Indeed, the nature of every serious economic and social problem may be significantly influenced by taking the importance of freedom seriously, freedom in the sense that I've been trying to discuss in this talk. I will stop here and look forward very much to discussion. I hope it will be a lively discussion with great questions and answers. The answer to the question, what's wrong with inequality, may ultimately involve the fairness of giving social attention to all in a symmetric way. But we must recognize that there will be different ways of understanding how people can be treated as equals. Central to those debates is a clear need to fathom and clarify what the way to think about actual freedoms that people enjoy. To end with an analogy, if slavery entailed a sharp inequality of freedom against which the United States fought 150 years ago, there are other inequalities in substantive freedom that persist today in the world, including in the United States, that demand our intellectual as well as our political attention. So I end by thanking for the privilege of having given the opportunity of talking about this issue today. Thank you. I have to explain that I have kind of 35 years of running has produced terrible effects on the knees, one of which is replaced and the other is not. So after I talk, I get completely frozen. And when I hobble to the chair, usually the audience decide that I'm having a heart attack or something. But I'm not having that. And in about 2 minutes, after I've stretched my leg, I will be in good shape. I do what I found my 2-year-old grandson do, who was visiting with his parents us in the weekend. I noticed that he doesn't go from one chair to another since he can't walk until he holds his chair, and then only after he's got hold of the other chair, he would let the first one go. So I'm going to take strategic advice from my grandson.
I'll be your chair.
I think I can just about follow the grandson's advice.
Please, if you have questions, line up behind the microphones. I am going to exercise the host privilege by asking the first question. And if you've never heard of the host privilege before, I just invented it, but I'm going to ask the first question anyway. Professor Sen, the way in which relative poverty can generate absolute poverty is interesting, and I think it's underappreciated. But the results of Marmot and others suggest that this happens when there are certain kinds of social relations between those who are more advantaged and those who are less advantaged. And so I want to ask you a question that bears on issues of global inequality. What sorts of social relations do you think are necessary for the relative poverty to cause the absolute poverty? Is the sort of relationship that we now have in the global community enough, or is it really membership in a single society that produces these effects?
Well, I think there are two questions here. I think there is at one level certainly global differences in living standard have tended to produce a kind of aspiration on the part of the relatively rich in the poor countries who have generated standards which A, absorb a lot of resources, including governmental resources, and B, also make others feel that they're definitely deprived compared with people running around with fast cars and other such problems. And this is not a new problem, and this is also my first PhD student in Cambridge was 55 years ago, actually, and he was an Italian. He was working on what the Italian called Mezzogiorno, namely the South. And one of the problems was that many of the relatively richer habits have spread south, so that quite often, even though they're poor, rather than the money going in for nutrition, often went into other things. I mean, that's actually what Adam Smith, of the two examples that he gives of that proposition, which is really a Smithian proposition, one of them is that the standard of normal living is made much higher by the presence of relatively rich people. So that, as he points out, if you live in a very poor country, you don't mind, you can participate in a public discussion. As, for example, Nelson Mandela discusses in his Long Walk to Freedom, that in the village, in his native village, in the Regent's house, when people met, they could discuss anything, and the clothing they may not have even a shirt or may not be properly dressed in any Western sense. On the other hand, as Smith says already in the 18th century, you cannot appear in public without shame, without having certain things like having a linen shirt and so on. He says leather shoes. Actually, that seems to have gone out of fashion, but in his time clearly was in fashion. And he also says a very peculiar thing, namely it's necessary in London to have leather shoes, but not in France, in Paris, because it was at that time a little poorer. It's necessary in London, but not in Edinburgh. So there is that issue. But there's also the issue that there are huge inequalities in the different countries. I think most of the problems with inequalities, for example, in India, and if you have time, I will be happy to talk a little about the nature of it, the pernicious nature of it. I don't think most of it is coming from outside. I think it's coming from the social barriers within the country. Yeah. And if you ask the question of the kind that India has terrible healthcare and no acceptance of the right of everyone to have a healthcare. And it's very peculiar because people have been talking about it for 3,000 years. Gautam Buddha in 6th century BC was talking about the importance that prevents people from having premature mortality, morbidity, disability, he talks about. And yet, why doesn't it happen? Because it's always somehow been translated that, yeah, these are very important, but not for everyone. Mm-hmm. I think that. And here I must say, I think the international influence is entirely positive. There is a lot to try and learn from Europe, National Health Service. America is up and down on that, from China, from Japan and South Korea, and Thailand too. So I'm generally suspicious of blaming the international roots of inequality for many things, because it can do that, but it also does the opposite of inspiring people to do something positive. I'm sorry, I gave a long answer.
So let me say two things to our questioners. Please, if you're comfortable, say what your name is, if you're a student, what your major is, if you're a faculty member, what department you're with, and please keep your questions brief and no follow-up questions. So let's start right here.
Hello, my name is Wyatt. As a psychology major, I'm particularly interested in expectation effects, such as the placebo and nocebo effect. You said in the middle of your talk that even if someone on the lower end of relative inequality were cheerful about that inequality, they still would be affected in certain ways by their social situation. What extent, if any, do you think that expectation effects, such as the placebo and nocebo effect, can explain the apparent consequences of relative inequality that you've discussed in your talk? And if they can explain those consequences in major ways, does that have normative implications?
Yeah, excellent question. Let me say two things here. One is that the placebo effect could be quite important, and that works in one direction, namely that if you are made to feel that, look, this is good and your life isn't so bad, and if you feel cheerful, well, that is and if that makes you really in some way better, and that is a positive thing, and we shouldn't decry that. That's certainly right. On the other hand, it has two problems, that line of reasoning. One is that it may also prevent you from agitating for change, because you get smug and you feel, and this is the way inequality has always been solved, that, there's something, it's not so bad, you have your own way of being excellent and respect. I used to, when I was young and had more strong political views than I've managed to retain over the years, I remember I used to get very upset about the word dignity of labor, saying, okay, you go on laboring, it's very back-breaking. In this country now, mining is regarded for some reason as very good work. But of course, typically it's been seen as the most back-breaking of all work and highly dangerous. And if you take that to be, this country in the context of the presidential election, but if you go on saying, yeah, but your work is terrible, but we respect you, you have dignity, I found that very unacceptable as a statement, that dignity is a very important thing in its own, but it can be an excuse for not doing enough about substantive changes. The other point is that I wasn't saying that, with the placebo, you quoted me saying that it may affect you in another way. I was mainly concerned that when the social statistician like you looked at it, you say, look, this chap is not so badly off because he's cheerful. I would say that is not acceptable, because if he has created, first of all, your life is very deprived. He doesn't, he's in debt, he's looking for a job, he's not getting a job. When he gets a job, it's a low income, and he can be dismissed any time. He doesn't know, he's worried constantly about where to go if there's an illness. But amidst that, he had generated some cheerfulness, and people do. I think it would be adding insult to injury by saying that he is not so badly off because he's cheerful. Because all his deprivations are there. The fact that he is cheerful should not reduce his claim to social attention. So that's the point I was making. So these are on the other side, but what you were saying on the placebo thing is also correct. So it's a question of, I'm sorry, being a teacher, as always, my children always complain that I can't stop assuming that I'm giving a class lecture. That you will find often that that's the case. There's a plausible argument on one side. You have to ask, are there any arguments against? And these are the two arguments against here. But thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hello, Dr. Sen.
Hi.
Thank you for speaking with us today. My name is Phil Barker. I'm currently a biology major here, a senior, and next year I'll be attending medical school at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. You spoke very heavily about the importance of freedom and also the importance of breaking down barriers to freedom. So I was wondering, in the sense of healthcare, in the context of healthcare in the United States, what are some of these barriers that future medical professionals and policymakers must break down to improve outcomes?
So say a bit more. In what way do you mean?
Well, oftentimes when I think of healthcare in the United States, I think that the primary problem is access, and we need to improve access to people. But I feel like there's more to the issue than that. So I was wondering from your perspective, what do you say?
Well, that certainly is, you're absolutely right there. I would say, access is a good word. I think affordability, which is already used in the Obamacare, is very important because there may be access in the sense you can go there, but you may not be able to afford it. And of course, it produces the peculiar roots of getting health care when you are not in a position to afford the standard one. I knew it when my children were growing up in the Harvard Square area. We live just outside Harvard Square. And when they were young, they are quite old now, but when they were young, and there were a lot of people they mixed with who really didn't have any secure income and no any means of medical coverage. And they often came to my home because my home is about 3 minutes walk from Harvard Square, and they would come and have coffee and tea. And I gathered, talking with them, I gathered what the strategy was, that when you get into some kind of illness, you have to get into some kind of an accident. And then you go to the emergency. And then for a little while you get attention, even for unrelated to the accident, something else you had when a doctor is looking at it. It's the other side of the professionalism of medical care. This country is full of contradictions. It has the best medical care in the world, but it also has the worst neglect of medical care. And similarly, it has got hugely professional ethics. None of them they will be billed. None of them will be, they will be billed, but they will not be sued. And they would go back again, and they won't say that you didn't pay the last time you billed. They would do it. And I've talked later, since I'm interested, in the last 2 years I've been teaching a course in the medical school and in the public health school, first with a colleague of mine called Paul Farmer, who is a great doctor. And he and I taught a course in the medical school. And then the next 2 years I taught a course in public health school. I'm taking a gap from medicine this year. And I found that that's a very ingrained value among the doctors too. Which goes along with profit-seeking and the other things that many Europeans find difficult. So there are all kinds of problems, but they have different sides to it. And I think if I would like a real, the studies have been all done so far in terms, rightly, for what alternative. Obamacare was a particular way of doing it earlier, that the Clintons tried that. I think it would be nice to have an epistemological study of the values of the doctors and the medical profession, as well as the medical administrators, what they would exercise and what they would not. And it's really quite important, and accountability is certainly one of them, but there's a sense of responsibility. I don't think, for example, the National Health Service in Britain or Europe would not have run but for a responsibility that goes well beyond accountability. There will be, I mean, I had a medical condition, which I'm out of it now, but since I was in England, I called a doctor, and my old doctor, and he's retired meanwhile. And I said, look, could you find out whether did I ever have that? It was a kind of, I was getting a kind of, there's a term for it, AFib, atrial fibrillation. And I was getting, I'm out of it now, but I said, did I have that? Because I remember the doctor checking my pulse rate. And then she said, look, it's 5 o'clock now. I'm supposed to go somewhere. And she said, I'm very much better in giving medical advice than pursuing history. But I will pursue history. And she called me about 8 o'clock, her time, and saying that she had found it. And indeed, I didn't have that illness at that time. Now, no one would have held it against her that she didn't do it, because 5 o'clock her duty time was over. But she did it out of what? A sense of responsibility, which is not accountability. So those who think responsibility is the same as accountability, I think entirely mistaken. Responsibility is enormously more than that, of which accountability is only one part. And I think in very different ways, the American and the European system, and also we have to look at the Japanese and the recently evolving the Chinese system, what the Koreans did, what the Thais do now. Already they have been doing with this 30 baht scheme of covering everyone. There are enormous amounts to be learned on the ethics and human values issues, if I may point out, about how the different cultures of helping others, of which medical treatment is one, but education is another, is there. I think we would be living in a much more racist society in every country in Europe and in America, but for the role of the primary schools, by which an abiding value, not always totally followed, but has been a school atmosphere you do not encourage racist thinking. It has played a hugely important part in thinking about that. So I think I extended your question, but as you can see, I think what you are suggesting is very important, but I want to go more beyond that, and perhaps you and I could chat on that.
Thank you. Please.
I'm always impressed that there's always a sense of geographical fairness. One on each side, yeah.
Hello, my name is Kushagra. I'm a sophomore majoring in economics and political science and minoring in screenwriting. And my question goes back to the idea that you pointed out about sacrifice and freedom. So you railed against the idea that you can't have the government asking people to sacrifice or curtail their freedom and develop the country that manner. But if you look at, say, South Korea and Singapore, or to an extent Taiwan and China, you'll see that political and other freedoms have been curtailed initially to reach that economic development. And these societies, especially Singapore and South Korea, have still been able to maintain decent amount of social and economic equity. So how would you explain that?
I would react by saying that I think you may have to re-examine the reading of these countries. First country, take the Asian ones, the first country that began in that was Japan. So shortly after the Meiji Restoration, 1860s, the Hideyoshi and a number of others said, what we need most now is education. Now, Hideyoshi made a lovely statement saying, why is it that American workers are more productive than Japanese? This I have to tell you is 19th century story. I don't think that would be necessarily the story today. But And then he said, well, that's because the Americans are educated, we are not. So that's how began Japan's attempt to get itself fully literate in 40 years, everyone going to school. South Korea did something very similar, drawing always on their past too, including the Neo-Confucian thinking and Buddhist thinking also. But then education, healthcare. When Lee Kuan Yew, who was the leader of the Union and Labour Party, went to England, as he says in Singapore story, he noticed, he was very most impressed of all, he was with the National Health Service. And then, of course, there's the Lee Kuan Yew touch. Rather than being completely free, I should charge them something, like sixpence. And they discussed the incentive thing. But you can see that the idea of everyone having health care is very important. Now, the tyranny that is in India, that's emerging now, includes also tyranny of oppression. And there you might be able to say that India was better off in many ways than Singapore was, and China was until recently, and probably in some respects is today. On the other hand, in terms of the basic facilities for leading a free life full of freedom, education, healthcare, social safety net, all over Asia, with the exception of South Asia, India, Pakistan, and even actually Bangladesh has overtaken India in this respect. It had been strikingly more committed to a full freedom position in the broader sense. So I think I would not agree with the view that what you're saying says anything against freedom. It's just the opposite. It's the freedom-oriented approach that has got them there, accepting freedom has been broadly interpreted. And I don't want to be misunderstood. I think it's very important to have free speech, very important not to be stopped from publishing something, not afraid of that. And in some respects, India had some achievement. But Ronald Reza and I studied that if you look at the huge amount of editorials, it's something like 1 in 60 editorials deal with the lack of healthcare and education of huge section of the community. And I think there the stratification has played an abysmally big part in keeping people unfree, which mere freedom of expression does not compensate.
Thank you.
Please.
Hi, my name is Brian Lutz. I'm a fourth-year computer science student at Ohio State, and I was hoping you could elaborate more on the removal, I think it's dark money is a term, like the $50 and $100 bills in India, the removal of dark money from India and the effect that's had on their economy.
You're talking about the demonetization? Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think there's a lot of money abroad, but they don't come in the form of these notes. You know, there's a lot of studies by dark money. I take it you were calling black money. The Indian expression is black money, and the black money goes through other channels, and they never go in terms of notes. You don't carry notes onto Switzerland in your briefcase. You don't. You get paid differently. So I think it was estimated about 6% of black money was held in currency, so that even if it had been completely successful, it would have dealt with mainly 6%. But in fact, about 95% of the currencies have already been recashed. So that, maybe there will be some legal cases, but not many have come yet. So I don't think that approach really worked. And I think what worked, I have to say that, I was critical of that, and so were many others. And some people said that, look, they've got it wrong. Look at the way that people have reacted. Clearly it has been successful. Where I disagree is that I don't judge the success of an economy by saying which party they vote for. People have voted for absolutely terrible things which are not accepted as bad, because India is just full of history of that. Last life you did bad things and therefore you're having all these problems this life. Don't complain about it. This life you behave better, next one you would do much better. There's a whole lot of these things. At the time of the Irish famine, there wasn't a single boat flowing from down the River Shannon carrying poultry and milk products and cheese to prosperous England out of Ireland. Not one of them. There was no grumble about it. No one got killed. Most of the boats were not even guarded. And then, 50 years later, that made it impossible for Britain to have England to have a normal relation with Ireland. I think that may well happen in India too, in the demonetization. But the fact that it happened in 50 years' time indicates that to expect that in the next election in the United Province, you have Uttar Pradesh, you have that was a mistake. Okay? But if you're interested, I can tell you about a few studies that have been made. I hope that there will be more studies now, because this issue has been taken up by a number of economists I know, young economists I know. See, my known way of learning things for a long time now has been to get a good student and ask him or her to do it. And then when she finishes her PhD, I'm a much more learned person. And since the other day I was counted, very proud of it, I found that there are 155 PhD students for whom I was either the sole advisor or the chair of the committee. So, and then I decided, well, that's why I've learned something.
Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Sen. My name is Arshad Ahmed, and I'm a physics and political science student here.
Asad?
Arshad, yeah.
Asad, yeah.
You mentioned that there are certain sorts of inequalities. You mentioned the disability thing. Is there not just an earnings gap that could be addressed by
Yes.
redistribution? There's also a conversion gap. That even if they were to be given more money, they wouldn't necessarily equate to a higher attainment of like.
No, I didn't mean that.
Really?
Okay, no, go ahead, finish it. Finish
I just wanted to ask,
answer.
what other sorts of disadvantages, what other sorts of inequalities, other sectors, does there exist an analogous conversion handicap? And by that I mean, there's not as clear of an money in, effect out relationship for like scientific productivity, for the ability to perform high wage jobs for the kinds of communities that we're trying to address here.
You know, money is always a good thing to have.
Yeah.
Yeah. And all I was saying is that you don't fix poverty level. I mean, I was saying two things. One, you don't fix the poverty level as the same level of income, irrespective of whether you're handicapped or not. And the disability has not been incorporated in poverty measurement. There was a little attempt in the United States, but not very much. And Britain, not. Germany, France, not. And you have to adjust for the processes. That's why I was quoting Wibke Kukles's work. And so you need money, but you need more money for that reason, and that's the conversion handicap. I was also saying that even after the conversion handicap had been met, you have the money, and instead of not being able to walk, you now have something to hold on to, you can walk. You may not be able to walk as well as others, and that deprivation hasn't gone away either. So you have to take that into account also. So I was splitting up these things. But I wasn't arguing against these things. Now, as far as the other things are concerned, whether to what extent money, I mean, if you were you talking about scientific disadvantage? Yes, yes.
Things that these sort of disadvantaged communities, they don't have the ability to produce valuable things for which they would be paid, essentially. And the conversion handicap, I essentially...
Yeah, I wouldn't go the conversion handicap there because, you know, I've been quoting Smith, but let me go back to Smith. There's a passage where Adam Smith has been seen in such narrow lights that there are 13 lines that people read about the butcher, the baker, and the brewer. That's it. But if you read something else of the book, at one stage he said that the main source of productivity increase in the world is learning. And for that you need education, and for that you need practice. And for practice you need division of labor, and trade helps you. That's the reasoning he goes. And there's also you need leisure in the context, just as I was talking about the Michael Marmot thing, where he's discussing that. He said, what happens to people like us? He's writing to Hume, David Hume, I think. And he says that, well, you know, we come back, even if we had a job, I come back exhausted. Then we have some time to recover, and then we read a book or so. Whereas a heavily worked manual laborer comes back, he's too exhausted to read anything. So not only is the employment low, there's no way of improving it. In any case, this person has had worse education in school, but then it tends to accumulate. And then he makes an appeal of how to change it. And the important, interesting thing, given the way Smith has had biased reading, there's a section where he says, why do you need good political economy? He said, we need it for two different reasons. One, because it will increase people's income, which would allow them to have a better life. And second, because it will give the state more money to provide education, healthcare, and so on, which the state alone can provide, which others cannot. So I think it's this combination that we're looking at. So I think I would look at that direction rather than, he has conversion handicap too, but that's not to look at in this case, Assad, I think. But thanks for the question.
Hi. Very
How
short.
about you?
Sorry.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Kelly Wilson. I'm a doctoral student in international agriculture development. I'm specializing in gender and livestock management, but I mostly care about chickens.
Chicken.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
Like
chicken.
village chicken production.
Okay, yeah.
So my question is about, in terms of freedom, the idea of freedom of mobility, especially with restrictions based on cultural norms and religious norms. And if you've seen or can think about any strategies towards decreasing those barriers of freedom of mobility.
Of barriers coming from
cultural norms.
Cultural norms, yeah.
And I'm certainly speaking, well, it could be, there's a lot of different aspects of freedom of mobility, but from cultural norms and religious norms based around, you could look at it as gender or certainly a socioeconomic status.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a very big issue. I think the extraordinary thing about culture, though, has been cultures move quite quickly also. But the only way of doing it is practice, actually. I mean, if you want to do something about, say, becoming a doctor, and it's easier for women to become a doctor, then becoming a doctor is a very good way, not only for yourself, but also for others. I think we tend to underestimate the extent to which things move. If you look at food habits, I can't take chili, because when I was 18, I had cancer in the mouth, and I had a high dose radiation, and along with that, I'm allergic to chili. And I'm impressed by the fact that India used to have perfectly decent food until the 16th century when the Portuguese arrived from the New World with chili. Indians didn't have any chili. And then they suddenly developed, and they fell to chili like fish to water. And then of course, all the food became inedible, as far as I can see. Food habits spread very well. I mean, I read in one of the tourist guides that the authentic British fare is the curry. And since the curry, of course, the curry should be, the British should get credit for it, because I think if Indians didn't have curry, I mean, it was a concoction made in the British Army mess. But that's the most successful thing. And now, of course, there are things like chicken tikka masala. And I read in the Telegraph someone being described as she is as English as daffodils or chicken tikka masala. And that indicates that it has reached and grown roots in a way that you would hardly think possible. So I think habits change. Difficult things, you know, when our Crash of Civilization, Samuel Watt. I can't, in my old age who wrote Crash of Civilization? Huntington, yeah. When Simon Huntington wrote the book, he said that in 1940s, Ghana and Korea had the same level of income. Now Koreans have 7 times more income. What changed? And he said, well, then his answer is because Koreans believed in hard work and the Ghanaians did not believe in hard work. I mean, this is, of course, had it not been a friend and a colleague, I would have called this racism. But then why is it in the 40s, if Koreans are so hardworking and Ghanaians not, how come they had the same income in the 40s? Something changed. What changed is that Korea was a low education country and became rapidly, to a great extent following Japan, one of the highest education countries, where the students are constantly worried about whether they're doing the best possible in class, and so on. So things change. And I think that the way they change, how did that happen? Well, first of all, government played a part. But people imitate each other. So I think cultural barrier is a barrier to be overcome. Not that it doesn't exist, but it's not a barrier in the sense that it's not like the imagined Mexican wall, which no one will be able to cross. It may be like the actual Mexican wall, which people would be easily able to cross. Thank you.
With apologies to those of you who are still in line, I think I need to call.
I'm sorry, it's my fault. I keep answering it.
I'm very sorry. Please join me in thanking Professor Sen for his talk.
Thank you.